So why are we addressing this issue of Palestine and Israel yet again? I have a simple answer and a complicated answer. My simple answer is that because it persists, and that we have all invested so much time and energy to understand the intricate details and dynamics of this conflict, that if we didn't meet and discuss it, we would be kind of at a loss for what to do. In a more academic sense, Professor Norman Finkelstein just recently wrote in the New Left Project publication the following, which says it better than I can, and I quote, "When a conflict endures for such a protracted period of time, huge numbers of individuals and institutions develop a vested interest not in its resolution, but instead in its perpetuation, what's now called only half facetiously the peace industry. Many are now consumed by the dreadful prospect that after a full century, it might actually end. All those UN special sessions and special committees, all those Ramallah-based NGOs, Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations, and conflict resolution getaways, all those IMF, World Bank, and crisis group reports, all those academic programs, all those film festivals, scholarly studies, memoirs, and poetry, all those Washington-based Israel think tanks, all those Palestinian solidarity activists, groups, websites, researchers, and analysts. A huge, sprawling superstructure has been built on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and consequently, he says, a major obstacle to an agreement is now the fear and trembling across the political divide that it might actually be coming to a denouement. Is it not convincible? Unquote. Then there is my more difficult answer, but one that I believe is equally accurate. The issue of Palestine reflects a historical injustice so large and so blatant that its flame refuses to extinguish. Furthermore, now that the Palestinians have engaged sincerely, for the most part, in nonviolent resistance, be it via the boycott, divestment, sanction campaign, civil disobedience, or diplomatic maneuvering, the Palestinian struggle for freedom and independence is challenging the existing world system of governance. More on that in a second. As the title of this talk reflects, there are two pivotal concepts that I would like to address: Palestine in perpetual limbo and new paradigms. I've also divided my talk into two parts. The first being that of a Palestinian-American businessman trying to make sense of the political scene which dictates our every single day in Palestine. And the second part being that of a Palestinian parent listening to his children. Let's start with why we are in perpetual limbo. Over 100 years of foreign interference in the region, Turkey, France, United Kingdom, Russia, UN, and the US, all resulting in 66 years of colonialization and ethnic cleansing, the creation of a new state, Israel, on the ruins of the Palestinian presence between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. The state has no resemblance whatsoever to that of United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181, the Partition Plan, which spoke of two states in economic union, with Jerusalem being a corpus separatum, with Israel being on 56% of the land, not its current 78% plus settlements. In addition, 47 years of military occupation, which can barely be classified anymore as temporary, as the definition of occupation states in international law. And finally, 20 years, 2 decades of bilateral negotiations, which started lopsided, with Palestinians recognizing the state of Israel, and in return, Israel recognizing not Palestinian statehood, but rather the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. And even then, Israel kept all of the parties of the PLO as outlawed parties and continued to assassinate their leaders until today, not to mention the dozens and hundreds of Palestinians affiliated to those PLO factions which are in Israeli prisons. Today's Israeli position rests on the assumption that procrastination will continue to tilt the strategic balance increasingly in Israel's favor. In short, Israel is not a serious negotiating partner. I don't believe Israel ever truly had the intention of resolving this conflict in an equitable fashion. Here, I do not speak of the current Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, but rather I'd like to point to a speech given by the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, as he spoke in the Knesset to garner ratification of the third part of the Oslo Agreement. He stated clearly and outspokenly the Israeli parameters for the endgame. Let me quote a few lines from his October 5th, 1995 talk. This would be a talk, his last, that he would give in the Knesset before being assassinated by an Israeli Jewish terrorist. Rabin said, quote, "In the framework of permanent solution, we aspire to reach, first and foremost, the state of Israel as a Jewish state, at least 80% of whose citizens are and will be Jews," unquote. So Netanyahu's Jewish state is not of his own making. Rabin continues, "We view the permanent solution in the framework of the state of Israel, which will include most of the area of the land of Israel, as it was under the rule of the British Mandate, and alongside it, a Palestinian entity which will be home to most of the Palestinian residents living in the Gaza Strip and West Bank. We would like this entity to be less than a state," unquote. So Netanyahu's no independent Palestinian state is not of his own making. Rabin, quote, "The borders of the state of Israel during the permanent solution will be beyond the lines which existed before the Six-Day War. We will not return to the 4th of June 1967 lines," unquote. So Netanyahu's no return to 1967 lines is not of his own making. Rabin continues, "And these are the main changes, not all of them, which we envision and want in the permanent solution. A, first and foremost, united Jerusalem, which will include both Ma'ale Adumim and Gi'avat Ze'ev as the capital of Israel under Israeli sovereignty," unquote. So Netanyahu's ignoring of international law and UN resolutions is not his own making. Rabin continues, "B, the security border of the state of Israel will be located in the Jordan Valley in the broadest meaning of that term," unquote. So Netanyahu's Jordan Valley security border is not his own making. Rabin, C, changes which include the addition of Gush Etzion, Efrat, Bitar, and other communities, most of which are in the area east of the Green Line prior to the Six-Day War, unquote. So Netanyahu's annexation of more lands in the West Bank is not his own making. Lastly, Rabin continues, D, the establishment of blocks of settlements in Judea and Samaria, like the one in Gush Katif, unquote. So Netanyahu's continued illegal settlement building is not really of his own making. And interestingly, for all those blinded by the fear-rattling of security, Yitzhak Rabin said, quote, we re-emphasize that the Palestinians were not in the past and are not today a threat to the existence of the State of Israel, unquote. Thus, we are not facing a right-wing Israeli government. We are facing the state institution of Israel, which has embedded within it an exclusivist ideology of Zionism, bent on maintaining a worldview which gives preferential treatment to Jews and is bent on redemption of the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, Greater Israel, despite all. Israel's strategic calculations are wrong. Israeli strategic planners overestimate their own strength and underestimate the strategic opportunities available to the Palestinians. There are four main perceived alternatives to a negotiated agreement that are attractive to Israel and therefore prevent Israel from reaching a final settlement on the terms offered. It is a key strategic aim of Palestinians to make clear to Israel that all four of these alternatives are simply not available. Israeli alternative number one, the default option, prolonging negotiations indefinitely by pretending that progress has been made and that suspensions are temporary, like those during the last 20 years, with ongoing encroachments and military incursions, few burdens, and considerable financial and other benefits from continuing the military occupation. Israeli alternative to negotiations number two, a pseudo-provisional two-state arrangement with a strengthened but severely constrained Palestinian Authority masquerading as a Palestinian government, while Israel disaggregates and picks off the historic issues and retains permanent control. Israeli alternative number three, a unilateral separation dictated by Israel. This is now being promoted by the sitting Israeli foreign minister as including redlining the Israeli eastern border to incorporate inside the Palestinian Bantustan some of Israel's own Palestinian and Christian population, Muslim and Christian population, Israeli citizens. Alternative number four, a control of the occupied territories by Egypt and Jordan. The Jordan is Palestine option has never really come off the Israeli agenda, something I wrote about when Ariel Sharon was first elected prime minister. But these four options are totally unacceptable to Palestinians. They do not take in consideration national aspirations, nor, indeed, they aim to undermine Palestinians' national identity and rights altogether. So if Israel refuses to negotiate seriously for a genuine two-state outcome, Palestinians can and will block all four alternatives using a combination of four linked reorientations to be undertaken singly or together. And here are the four paradigms, new paradigms, under consideration. Paradigm number one, the definitive closing down of the 1988 negotiation option of two states, long abused by Israel. This blocks the first two preferred Israeli alternatives to a genuine agreement, which is negotiated, which is never-ending negotiations or a Bantustan state agreement. Paradigm number two, the reconstitution of the Palestinian Authority so that it will not serve future Israeli interests by legitimizing indefinite occupation and protecting Israel from bearing its full burden of the costs of occupation. This also blocks the first two preferred Israeli alternatives and also helps to block the third, unilateral separation. Paradigm number three, the elevation of smart or intelligent resistance over negotiations as main means of implementation for Palestinians, together with reassertion of national unity through reform of the PLO, the empowerment of Palestinians, and the orchestrated eliciting of regional and international third-party support, such as what we're doing at the UN today. The central aim will be to maximize the cost of continuing occupation for Israel and to make the whole prospect of unilateral separation unworkable. And lastly, paradigm number four. Paradigm number four is the shift from a two-state outcome to a binational or unitary democratic single state as Palestinians' preferred strategic goal. This reopens a challenge to the existence of the State of Israel in its present form, but in an entirely new and effective way, much more effective than the case was before 1988. In short, Palestinians are able to block all four of Israel's best alternatives to a genuine negotiated outcome via a fundamental reorientation of strategy. Israel is not able to block this reorientation. The result of such a reorientation would be far worse for Israel than that of a genuine negotiated outcome. The result of such a reorientation would be far better for Palestinians than any of Israel's four alternatives to negotiated outcomes. Therefore, when Palestinians calculate that a genuine negotiated outcome is no longer available, and I believe we're getting very close to that point, if not already there, they undoubtedly will reorient their strategy, not only rhetorically, but in reality, and will finally close down the historic offer which has been on the table for more than 20 years of a two-states negotiated outcome. The gist of this analysis is part of our work in the Palestine Strategy Group. You can find the two reports that we've issued, and the third one should be coming out within a month, at palestinestrategygroup.ps. Next, I'd like to shift to the second part of my talk, which is to speak to you as a parent raising two daughters in Palestine. I don't need a paper for this part. I have two daughters, Areen and Nadine. Areen is a sophomore at MIT studying chemical engineering. Nadine is an 8th grader, top of her class at the Friends Quaker School in Ramallah. And my children, like yours, are globalized modern children. When I see my daughter, she usually has her earplugs in, tied to her iPhone, playing Angry Birds, listening to music, doing her homework, and talking to me, all at the same time. And as an old school person, I don't exactly know how that happens together at the same time. So before she graduated from high school, I write frequently on the Palestinian issue, and I wanted to write about the youth perspective on the future. So I asked if she would bring a few of her classmates to have a discussion with me about politics, and they came. And the first question I asked them was, are you aware that you're militarily occupied? Because it doesn't look it. And I got an answer with a chuckle. Of course, Dad. Of course we know that we're under occupation. We know that the Mediterranean Sea is 40 minutes from our home, and we can't get there. We know that Jerusalem is 7.5 minutes from our home, and we can't get there. So you don't have to worry, Dad, she said. We fully understand that we are under total military occupation. And if you forgot, Dad, I was born in it. She says the 20 years of my life were the 20 years of walls, fences, checkpoints, bombings, security, movement and access restrictions, etc. So she answered my first question, knowing fully well that they are under military occupation. But she didn't stop there. She went further. And here she gave me a lesson in history that I'll never forget. And I'm actually writing about it right now. She said, but, Dad, we read our history a little bit different than you. She says, we see our history as the following. And of course, her classmates are all in agreement. She says, we know what happened in 1948. What happened to us was the equivalent of 100 9/11s striking on the same day. Half the population was displaced, not to mention the scores who were murdered in cold blood. And we did, she says, what any country would do. We tried to fight our way back. And this was in 1948, not in the year 2014. And she says, but Dad, we proved beyond a reasonable doubt that we don't know how to fight. Not only that, we are up against the fourth strongest military in the world, a nuclear power armed to the teeth by the US and Western countries, covered politically to an extent which has not been done for any foreign country in the world. So we never had a chance to fight our way back. And she says it took 25 years for us to reach that conclusion. And then what did we do, Dad, she says? She says we made a shift. We moved from armed struggle and trying to fight our way back to international law. We can actually put a date to this. It's around 1974. And when we went to international law, she says, we didn't just go to any international law. We went to the plumbing of international law. And she jokes, she goes, Dad, you're amazing. You can rattle off more UN resolutions than anybody wants to hear. And you have so much of the Fourth Geneva Convention memorized, and you're not even a lawyer. But she says, you know what, Dad? It doesn't matter, because we're still occupied. And then she says, you know what happened after that, Dad? After about 15 years of trying to find a way to implement international law, after swallowing the pill of international law, which is about this big for Palestinians to swallow, which is stuck right about here right now, we shifted gears again. The Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, which, by the way, are the minority of the Palestinians in the world community, they took a decision that enough was enough. International law was not working. They were going to shake off the occupation by themselves. By the way, the word intifada actually means to shake off. And my children say, do you know what that brought us, Dad? It brought us international attention. It also brought us broken bones. And the international attention turned a blind eye to what was happening on the ground. So she says, you know what, Dad? Even an intifada didn't end the occupation. We're still occupied. And she goes, and here's where she turns to me with a much more sober look. And she says, Dad, the next thing that happened, you know very well about, because you were part of it. And she says, after the Intifada proved that it couldn't end the occupation by itself, the Palestinians accepted the US dictate that the only way to end this conflict was for bilateral negotiations to take place, for the occupier and the occupied to sit down and work it out. Equivalent, in my opinion, to a rapist and raper being told, just go into the room and make up. It doesn't work. And I feel that my daughter actually wants to say, we were pretty stupid, Dad, to wait 20 years. Because during those 20 years, not only were we talking, but we were losing land, losing people, losing hope every single day. And she says, after 20 years, my daughter was born in the States, the older daughter. She came when she was 1 year old. We brought her to Palestine. And she lived her whole life under the Oslo period. And she says, Dad, when you brought me here in 1994, as soon as Oslo was signed, there were 100,000 Israeli Jewish settlers on the ground. Today, there's 500,000 plus Jewish settlers on the ground. So she says, you want to convince me, Dad, that talking works if the international community is still turning a blind eye to the reality on the ground? She goes, bilateral negotiations didn't work. And it took us 20 years to figure that out. And she says, where did we go next? After 20 years of diplomatic failure, after diplomatic failure, after diplomatic failure, we went back to the UN. But this time we didn't go to the plumbing of the UN, we went all the way to the top. We went to the United Nations General Assembly, we took with us the two-state solution in our own hands, and we placed it in front of the most multilateral agency in the world. And we said, world community, you decide. Is Palestinian deserving of statehood or not? 138 countries said yes. 9 said no. The US, Israel, the Czech Republic, Canada, the superpower of Micronesia, the superpower of Palau, and a few others. And my daughter says, you know what, Dad? It doesn't matter. Even if the majority of the world said yes, as long as the superpowers said no, we're still occupied. And then she ends with something that I have come to terms with. But my father, who's in Ohio, 75 years old, and he's there because he's not allowed to be in Palestine except as an American tourist, even though I live in the home that he was born in, would never come to terms with. He would die before coming to terms with. My daughter says, Dad, our generation is not going to make the same mistakes you made. Of course, she places the entire weight of the Palestinian decision-making for 60 years on my shoulder. And she says, maybe it's time that we look Israel in the face and say, you win. We're in a conflict, and we have proven that we are too weak to create a state, so you win. You get Israel, you get the West Bank, you get East Jerusalem, you get West Jerusalem, you get all of the water under the land, you get all of the airspace above the land, you get the Jordan Valley, and you know what else you get? Us. Now, we heard you have free health care in Israel. Where do we pick up our medical cards? And we want some of that free education too. In political terms, what did my daughter just tell me? She told me something that happened once before in our history. What my daughter is saying is that her generation is at a crossroads. It's a crossroads to redefine our self-determination. And I put 100 underlines under the word self. We don't have to ask anybody. We just need to get our political act in order. And basically, when we moved in 1974 from armed struggle to international law, we redefined our self-determination. Because for the first 25 years of this struggle, our self-determination was defined as one singular secular Palestine for Muslim, Jew, and Christian. Every Palestinian has that entrenched in their mind. In 1974, when we swallowed that pill of international law, we accepted upon ourselves two states as being the paradigm to resolve the conflict. Well, after the long period of time since then, and 20 years of failed negotiations, my daughters are at a different crossroads. They're at a crossroads between continuing on a statehood path which we are losing by the day, literally dunam by dunam by dunam, or to drop statehood and call for civil rights. The Israeli side knows exactly what's happening. The sitting prime minister during Ehud Olmert's period and the sitting defense minister, Ehud Barak, both in Hebrew, speaking to Israeli audiences, stated it very clearly, and it was covered in all of the media, that if the Palestinians make such a declaration for their own self-determination, the game is over. The model of the game is over. It may take another 100 years to resolve, but the model of how it will be resolved is over. So with that, I recall Condoleezza Rice's birth pangs and Secretary John Kerry's poof, and we continue our struggle for freedom and independence. Thank you.